Well, it's a good start, Jane, and it's great. Nathan and I are very much looking forward to coming and visiting you next week and tasting your wines. We are waiting for more people to arrive, but I'm conscious we want to. We've got a lot to cover, and we want to try and run this to sort of 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so. Um, so maybe you could start off by giving us as brief a précis as you feel possible of the two vintages under discussion this evening, the 2020, for which we'll be releasing the en primeur, in a matter of, weeks, probably, given the way things are going with Burgundy, and also, of course, the 2021 vintage, which you've just safely gathered in. So over to you, Jane.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody that I can't see, but thanks for for joining us, as Tom says, for another Zoom tasting. But it actually means that we can get together and do these things that didn't actually exist before. That I always think that that's been one of the good things that has come out of us all being stuck at home. Where do I start with 20 and 21? Every year is different. It doesn't matter whether it's look at the 10 years that I've made wine for my negociant: 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. They're all different. Every year the growing season is different. It comes with its challenges and its ease. I think this year maybe that one of the surprises, perhaps we weren't expecting to chaptalize again, but we've just gone back to a good old school Burgundy vintage. So I guess just to start with 2020, because that was the first one off the board. It was like 18 and 19. We had an early start to the season. We had a long, dry, hot summer. But the thing these days that every year is different, and as I said, every year has its challenges, and then people come through and they like to jump. People always like to jump on the extreme of whatever it is in that particular year. So whether it's the heat, whether it's the dryness of the vintage, whether it's the rain and the coolness of the year, people always tend to focus in on the extremities and go, oh, okay, so the wines are going to be this year because it was hot, because it was dry, they're going to be alcoholic, or because it was wet, they're thin. And you just can't make blanket statements about vintages. It will give you an idea of maybe the general nature of what the year will give you, but Burgundy is made up of so many small parcels, and it's on a hill, and the vines grow up the hill and down the hill. So just because it's particularly challenging for somebody down in the Morhange, someone up in Gevrey-Chambertin might not have any of those problems at all. So I think it's always very difficult and dangerous to say, well, this year was like this, because it depends on where you were, and it depends on where your vines are, and it depends on what you all those things that you did along the way. But that being said, the 2020s, I've just started to rack them, starting to put them into tank, getting them ready for bottling. And again, I know a lot of people had problems with 20s because they were rich, they were ripe, the acidity was lower, which always leads to challenges in perhaps some wines having spoilage issues. I didn't have any of those problems last year. And again, we've got so many tools at our disposal these days that if you think carefully about what you're doing and you use the things that we have available, there's really there's less and less bad wine being made, because people everyone's just paying more attention and being more careful about what they're doing. So 20s for me, it's always that year in barrel. Always helps to round them out and smooth them out, and they change. And I think the 20s, rather than people are thinking again, they're these big, rich, ripe years, and there will be wines that are high in alcohol, and maybe got picked a little bit too late. But overall, I'm really happy with the 20s that I've got. I think they're really elegant. They'll age really well. They're drinking really nicely at the moment. I actually can't wait to get them into bottle and get people, get them out there for people to start trying them, and then you get a year like 21, and being Australian, maybe there wasn't quite as much sunshine as I might have liked. The thing that has really marked this year is the frost that we had at the beginning of the year, and it's one of the problems that I think is going to be an ongoing thing that we have to deal with, is that the winters aren't as cold. So every year now the vines are starting to start growing earlier in the season, but then you can still have these cold these cold episodes up until the middle of May, and that's the thing that got us this year. And also what happened in 2016 is that the vines are growing, and then in April we had these incredibly cold nights. And what happened this year is the first night it was cold, everybody was out burning candles. They had their straw piles out there. I mean, it was literally, the whole coat was literally lit up. And so a lot of people got through the first night, but then the second night there was frost, and then the third night, and then by the end of it, I think it had got down from memory -7, -8, and there's not that much you can do. So that's why it's such a small vintage this year, is because it just got so cold at that point that there was not much you could do to save what was at risk. But like always, not that all the vines grow at the same time. So those vineyards that are in slightly cooler areas were pruned later, Chardonnay versus Pinot. So there's still vineyards out there that produced a good crop. So again, you can't go the blanket statement, okay, every area is down, because it's not the case. If I just look at what I get, and I'm predominantly red, so that already saved me, because the whites around Meursault and Puligny and Chassagne were terribly affected. But my Côte de Nuit, I was probably 50% down, or my grower was 50% down. My Corton Premier Cru, Le Corbeau, was up what it has been the last couple of years. Yes, hands in the air for that one. Gevrey Village was probably a little bit down, maybe 40% down on last year. Savigny Premier Cru, my grower got quite badly hit, but he made sure that I got, I think, half of the production, which is, I think 4 barrels instead of maybe 6. So, not too bad. So overall, I think I was actually pretty lucky. It's a cooler year, but then, in these warmer years, you forget that Burgundy is in a marginal climate, and it is a cool climate, and traditionally Burgundy is not high in alcohol. I think one of the best wines I made in 2019 was my Corton Bresson at 12.5%. We forget that you can still have these beautiful, ripe, elegant wines, and they don't have to be high in alcohol. So I think that there's going to be a lot of very nice surprises in 2020-21. And while the yields are down, I think when people actually start tasting the wines and seeing the wines, that a lot of people are going to be pleasantly surprised that just because of the frost, just because of the wet weather, and the cooler summer, that there's actually there's some really lovely, finer, elegant wines. And the whites, it's a great white year. Again, I was talking to Dominic this morning, and as I've mentioned to the Honest Grapes guys, I was lucky enough to get along to the Hospice this morning to taste the wines, and the whites, the 3 barrel, there's more than that, but the 3 barrels that there are of the white Hospice, it's the best I've ever tasted them. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's just another year, and it's different. And the quantities are tiny, but there's still some really beautiful wines. And even to Ludovine this morning, I just said, look, we all know how difficult it was because we had to do so much sorting. I mean, there's no getting around it. We had mildew, we had mold, we had unripe fruit. The sorting table was worth its gold this year. But if you had a team and you spent the time sorting through your fruit, and even if you still had to sort half of nothing and put whatever was left in the tank, it just makes such a big difference. And I think Ludovine this year at the Hospice has done. She's done an amazing job, and I was blown away by the quality of the wines this morning.
No, that's great news, Jane, and thank you for the sort of the précis of both years. I think certainly we as the consumers, or rather basically those who are not based in and amongst the vines, the moment we hear about frosts or we hear about drought or we hear about rain, or hail, we're there going, oh my God, this is a disaster, and we must be very concerned. So I think you painting that picture of what a patchwork quilt Burgundy is, of different vineyards, different terroirs, and I suppose probably most pertinently for this year, different kind of climates or microclimates and temperatures, clearly where some vineyards were more or less affected by those frosts is going to make a big difference. You mentioned talking to Ludovine and her thoughts on the 2021. Now, Nathan, you were actually just last week with Ludovine and Jasper Morris at the Sotheby's event about the run-up, the introduction to 21 Hospice. For those who aren't aware, Christie's have been running the show for a number of years now, and this will be the first vintage 2021 where they hand over to their long-standing rivals, Sotheby's. But Nathan, maybe you'll tell us a bit more about what the thoughts were from the Hospice itself and the wines that you tried, the back vintages.
Yes, good evening, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tasting from last week, the discussions with Ludovine Clévaux and Jasper Morris, and then about how the syndicate works and Tom and me bidding for the wines. As a start, I'd say I'm not one of these people who's bought an awful lot of things at auction. So actually, the first time we did this in 2019, it was a pretty terrifying experience. I'm not sure who was more terrified, whether it was Tom who was holding the paddle or me who was kicking him and trying to make sure that we didn't overspend syndicate money, because because I'm buying shares as well, so we realize we need to be we want to be responsible with everybody's money and buy the wine sensibly on behalf of the syndicate. As Tom has said, the auction is at the place behind me, the Hotel Dieu in the Hospices de Beaune, right in the centre of the town of Beaune. It'll be held Sunday week, the 21st of November at 2:30 French time. It goes on for about 6 hours or something. It's ludicrously long.
No, longer than that.
Longer than that.
Longer than that. Okay. And the thing that, if you've never been and bought something at an auction before, it seems so obvious when I say it, but once a barrel has gone, you can't go back and ask for it later. So you actually have to plan. You actually have to plan what you're going to buy in sequence of when you think they're coming up, not just in terms of which wines you want. So Tom and I, we've done a lot of work to think about which cuvées we're interested in. Our discussions with Jane, who we're delighted to say will be doing our élevage for this vintage, and then also with Ludovine Clévaux, Jasper Morris, and to be honest, anybody else will give us a bit of advice before we go and buy the wines. First of all, a bit of briefing from the tasting with Ludovine and Jasper. Unlike Jane, who's now already tasted this morning the 21s.
I thought I'd better prepare for tonight.
I know. But, this was a tasting of back vintages, and I tasted three whites and 5 reds. But first of all, their view of the vintage, very much as Jane has said, that I think probably as a Burgundy collector, as well as somebody who's involved obviously in honest grapes, we tend to sort of jump on whatever the big topic of discussion is, in this case, the frosts. But Ludovine was absolutely insistent, and you've heard this from Jane, that the issue with 2021 is quantity, not quality, and that what the frosts did and the other disease pressure in the vineyards meant there were less grapes to come in, meant they had to sort carefully on the sorting table, but the grapes were very healthy as they came in and after sorting. In a sense, really, the volumes we're talking about are much more like 2016, and that wasn't that long ago, although white was even less, but certainly in terms of red, most people are telling us stories like you've just heard from Jane, between 20 and 50% down, depending which vineyard. You only have to go back as far as 2016 to hear similar story, although different type of vintage that year. The harvest was very late, and Jane had said that already. It's the latest harvest, I think, in several years, Jane. And what's really exciting for me as a Burgundy collector is that the alcohol levels were back down to about 12.5%. And I have to say, and Tom and I talk about this a lot, I go around all the time snapping up 7s, 11s, 17s, you know, those vintages which were more Burgundian to me. Whereas the trio of solar years we've just had, 2018, 2019 and 2020, all in their different ways, are making very exciting wines, but wines that are less traditionally Burgundian in that sense. So, you know, you collect Burgundy for the variety of it, not just for getting the same Dr. Pepper style Carneros sort of Pinot soup each year. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that vintage variation. Jasper and I had some discussion about the different wines. I think the first thing to say, and just to knock this thing about quantity on the head, last year there were 630 barrels auctioned. This year there were 349 and 5 half barrels. The half barrels are because there are some cuvées they don't even have a full barrel of. The whites are down by about 70–80%. The red's down by about 50%. It's the smallest auction in terms of the number of barrels that will be auctioned since the 1970s, apparently. I haven't verified that, by the way. That was, I think, Ludovic's comment. But in terms of the tastes, the sort of words that Jasper was using were very sort of classic Burgundian vintage. It's about quality, not quantity. What that means for Tom and Jane and me trying to buy the barrels for the syndicate, I've no idea, and I'm awfully worried we're going to come away empty-handed, but we're just going to do our best and be sensible. In terms of the tasting, and I think, Jane, I'll give you a chance to come back on this because we've already had a bit of a chat about the cuvées. I tasted the most, I won't go through all 8, but in terms of the ones that we're sort of interested in, I tasted the most fabulous Beaune Premier Cru, but actually both a white and a red. I tasted the Cuvée Suzanne et Raymond White Premier Cru, but in particular, one, Jane, that we may be targeting, the Cuvée Gigon de Salin Premier Cru 2017, for me was an absolutely outstanding version of what 2017 did in Beaune. Beautiful elevated fragrance, a lot of depth, and sort of exciting, sort of rumbustious wine. It wasn't a timid Beaune Premier Cru. And I'm very much hoping that of the 9 or so Beaune Premier Crus that are in the auction coming up, that we might, I know, Jane, we've already been talking about 2 or 3, there might be something interesting there. I mean, I found the Corton, the Charlotte Dumais 2016, quite recalcitrant at this stage, but a lot of power, a lot of elegance, very exciting. Some of you from last year will have had one of the Volnay Premier Crus that we bought. I actually tasted the Jehan de Massol 2012, already starting to show some very leathery tertiary notes. That lovely way that Volnay gives a sort of texture. It's as much textural as fragrant, so there's just an awful lot coming on. Whilst I'd be absolutely delighted to say I'm not going to focus on the whites, except to say Tom and I always debate Genévrier versus Charme in Meursault. I'm actually drinking a Meursault Narvaux 15 from Val Saint-Girardin at the moment, and then going on to Jane's Fleury 2017. But the Genévrier Philippe Lebon Premier Cru 17, it's a fantastic year for whites, was superb. And then at the top end, the Mazy Chambertin and Clos de la Roche, I thought the Muzzy, I'm always a Muzzy person, but the Muzzy Chambertin Collignon was superb. So that was 2015. So that was a back vintage tasting. How we go from here is that we already have commitments for about, well, over a barrel and a half of a red and a barrel of a Grand Cru red. We are, unlike the last 2 years where we've bought in the first year, we bought a Pommard Premier Cru, and then last year a Volnay Premier Cru, and then at the Hospice de Nuits Saint-Georges, we bought 5 barrels of Nuits Saint-Georges Premier Cru. This year, we've thought that we should fit the vintage and fit Jane's winemaking style and interests by going for, we've called it a red, but it's likely to be a Beaune Premier Cru, perhaps a Savigny Le Beaune, perhaps a Village Volnay or Pommard. Please forgive us that we actually really want to do the tasting and find out. But by doing that, even though we expect the lower volumes will mean higher prices, we're looking for something that will taste really good and really typical from 2021. So we're sort of going in that direction. For the Grand Cru, we're likely they have some really interesting Cortons. And I think to have a Corton Grand Cru in our lineup, and particularly because of Jane's interest in Corton wines, I'm really excited to see if we can manage to snag a barrel or two. We'll say this again at the end, but a lot of you on this call are already in the syndicate. If you're not, please, it is now the sort of wrapping up time. We're looking for people's pledges. The way it works is Tom and I are out to Burgundy next Wednesday morning, and not tomorrow, but tomorrow week. We're doing tastings Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We'll be talking about we'll be seeing all of our wines at Etienne de Montiel's gaff down in Merceau and Pouligny on Friday morning, and then coming up to see Jane and talking her 20s and 21s. We then go to the Hospice pre-tasting of the 21s behind me at the Hotel Dieu on the Saturday morning, and then we bid at the auction on Saturday afternoon. Then in about Sunday afternoon, sorry, yeah. and then sometime like January, February, the barrels get released by Ludivine Crevaux. Jane will transport them down to her place outside of Beaune. And then Jane will look after them for the next year and a half or so while they mature. We'll then bottle them to your instructions with our own labelling and then deliver them to you either late in 2020, well, I'll get my years right, 23 or very early 24. Yeah. But the uniqueness of the wines is not only will the wines come from a very short series, probably of only a few, handful of barrels, but also uniquely these will have the élevage, the maturation from Jane. Jane, before we move on to the next bit, do you want to talk a little bit about Corton in particular?
Yes, and even just listening to what you've been saying, I've been buying Hospice barrels for 12, 13 years now. And every year I just go in and I taste and I see what I like. And there's sometimes and I've made the Guigon de Salins I bought in 2015. The Volnay, we bought that back in, when did we do that? 13, I think we bought the Volnay. And then Corton, I first bought into Charlotte Dumais, I bought in 2017. And then in 2019, actually, I went to the auction and I didn't have a client, but I just didn't want to let it go by because, as you know, I have a real thing for Corton, and I particularly have a soft spot for the Charlotte Dumais. So I just went and bought the barrel anyway, because even though I didn't have a client, I just wanted to have it in the cellar. So sometimes, we get a little bit of, whoops, I put my hand up at the wrong time and there you go, I come out with the barrel. But just to talk a little bit about Corton, it's the only Grand Cru red, as you all know, in the Côte de Beaune, and sometimes it gets a little bit looked down upon because it doesn't sit up with the others in Beaune and Gevrey, etc. But I think it's been so overlooked. I was lucky enough to get some fruit from a Corton Renard in 2013, and it just made this most beautiful aromatic wine that was so fine, and just, you know, just easy. It just, you walk past the tank in the winery and you could smell it, and that sort of started my love affair with Corton. And that vineyard got sold, and then I got some Marichaux in 2017, and further down the hill, and is a bit broody in its youth, but really very different. And then the year after, I actually managed to get some more Renard and also get some Corton Bresson. So I've actually been really lucky. And this last year I had some Perrier. So I've actually been really lucky over the years to vinify several of the different parcels that can, you know, that are named Corton Grand Cru. And they're just such great parcels, and they're all very individual in their characters, and so much better value for money for what you get when you compare the prices to the Grand Crus in the Côte de Nuit. And that's the thing as a negociant, is that I have to buy people's grapes, and so, you know, I generally pay a premium for them. And you have to look at, and it's the same when you buy wines. You shouldn't just buy it because it's got a label, a Grand Cru something, or I don't know, a Chambon Musini something, because just because it comes from that that particular commune that has this prestige to it, depending on where that fruit came from, how the wine was made, can really affect the quality of what's actually in the bottle. And that's the thing that interests me more, is what those grapes, what the quality of those grapes are, and what they do, rather than, oh, I have to have, you know, I would love to make Chambon, but I've never found something that I think is worth what I'm paying for to deliver it to my customers in a bottle later on. So you know, Corton is, you know, it's very variable. It has a lot of different faces. The Cortons from the Hospice are great because they, you know, they're a blend of Bresson and Renard, which are the Charlotte Dumais, which are, you know, two of the best parcels. And then you've got the Clos du Roi, which sits quite separately. So, I mean, tasting the three this morning, they're quite different, but they're really excellent. So I don't think, and I mean, when I go into the Hospice, I sometimes have an idea, I'd like this, I'd like that, and I taste and I go, well, actually this tastes better than that does this year. And so that's how I always go into it. I taste it and I write my notes and I just go, okay, and I go back to my clients, and we might have earmarked something and go, actually, I think these are the standouts, and then we usually, you know, and then we usually work it from there.
Thank you, Jane. And
sorry, Nathan. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So basically, is, I mean, I have to say, as somebody who's, you know, collected for Burgundy for a long time, Corton is one of those areas that it's taken me a long time to warm to, and I think that the change for me has been over the last few years. That in a weird way, the sort of global warming and those sort of long dry summers have actually benefited Corton. How do you think global warming has affected the Bresson, Renard, the areas of Corton that you're particularly in favour of, Jane?
I think it depends on, again, where the vineyard is. But you're right, because they're a little bit, you know, they're a little bit higher up, so they're almost a little bit cooler. They are east facing, like most of the Grand Cru vineyards are. I had one issue with the Corton that I bought. With the lack of water, it actually, it's 100 years old, so in the end that was just sort of it, that needed to come out. But you don't see that. I mean, as I said, in 2019, where the alcohol levels were higher in my wines probably than in most other years, the Corton Bresson was 12.5, and it was just perfect. So I think that it probably always stays a little bit cooler, maybe, than some that are in perhaps a little bit more of the cuvette of the Côte. So let's hope it doesn't get too popular. I don't want the prices to go up.
Exactly.
That's quite terrifying.
I think, Jane, the funny thing is, you You mentioned the Courton Renard 2013, but you might recall that was the bottle you brought over to
God, you
Tom
were so
Keville Davies. Well, not even a full bottle; it was a half drunk bottle.
half
You brought
left
over
over
when
bottle
we,
from another
yeah,
tasting.
when we first met in 2014. That was the first bottle, the first time we'd ever met, the first time I tried your wines, and that was really the opening salvo of the Honest Grapes and Jane Eyre relationship. So I mean, I think it would be amazing to come sort of full circle and do our own with you, basically.
Couldn't have scripted that if we'd planned it, could we?
Yeah, anyone would think we had. Now, team, just conscious of time, and I'm also aware that our buyer Nick has just come back from Burgundy as well. He didn't have the chance to visit you, but he did try, actually, as ever, a whistle-stop tour of a number of producers. And we'll just turn now to you, Nick, to give us a quick précis on your impressions of the 2020 vintage, because of course, whilst we've got the excitement of the 21 Hospice coming up, we're also barely a month away, or well, 6 weeks or so, from launching the 2020 Burgundy campaign. So Nick, what were your initial impressions of the vintage 2020 now?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I was lucky enough to be out in Burgundy last week. As you say, a whistle-stop tour, flying around over 3 days to see as many people either side of Beaune to taste their wines. And on the whole, I was very impressed with the quality. There has been sort of some negative comments about the vintage, but I think we do need to focus on the fact that negative side should more be towards the volume rather than the quality, because most people I spoke to were really proud of the work they had done and proud of the wines that they were showing, and with good reason. Certainly it was a warm vintage without a doubt, but at the same time many had a hard time explaining why the freshness within the wines was so present. There's a really nice lick of acidity in these wines that just gives it a lovely lift to them. So certainly on the white side, there's a little bit of ripeness of fruit, but beautifully tempered. And the producers we tend to work with there, really, I was impressed with their wines. And then moving up towards the Côte de Nuit, which was the latter half of the tasting in the week, was again really bright fruit, lovely freshness, and actually, volumes, they're not terrible, and really very impressive on the whole. So it's a good vintage, and I think it was Romain Topinot-Merme who said, if I had just had a little bit of rain before the harvest, then it would go down as one of the great vintages, and that's that says it all, really. He produced a lot of very good fruit, not as much as he wanted, obviously, and the wines are just singing, and it's very easy to taste at this early level, and that freshness really just lifts everything. So really, it's a good vintage, good to great. Obviously, as with Burgundy, it depends on the producer, it depends when you picked, it depends on lots of little details. But certainly there's a lot of good wine to be enjoyed if you're wily and clever about where you look. I think that was that's what I left with as a general rule. But certainly with a smile on my face, that's for sure.
Smile on your face and very red teeth.
Yeah, just about cleaned it up.
I certainly know from really my exposure to the 2020s were the Hospice 2020s last year, and the Hospices de Nuits and Hospices de Beaune 2020s, and certainly, although my tasting has been limited thus far, I totally echo what you have said about the surprising freshness in the whites of the 2020s. There really was no trace of baked apple fruit in the young wines at all. And you're right, the most of the growers were humble enough to be a little bit surprised by that. They're like, we don't know where this freshness comes from, but it's unequivocally there. And yes, the reds have a beautiful richness and sort of structural depth and opacity, which is very, very delightful. So I must admit, I for one can't wait to taste out next week. So thank you very much, Nick. I think now we'll return to the hospice as a conclusion, but I also should point out that I have a date for your diaries. We have on the 13th of January, Jane will be over from Burgundy in London for Burgundy Week. She'll be joining us for our Burgundy tasting at 67 Pall Mall, which is on the
11th.
11th. Thank you, Charlie. Excellent. There'll be hopefully plenty of space for that, although as usual we expect that to be full of people, although we'll make it as sort of COVID safe as we can. But we do have her as well for an exclusive dinner on the 13th of January, where we'll be showing off 7 of her wines, and we'll be doing this at Tosi, just in Victoria, which is a really wonderful little spot. It's an Italian restaurant, but I think we don't need to do heavy bone cuisine with your wines, Jane. It's a lovely place, and we'll be sending around more details about that. But certainly that's, if you love Jane's wines, and you should, of course, otherwise you wouldn't be here, then do put the 13th of January firmly in your diary. It's a good way of breaking your dry January month, almost middle of the way through. Have a quick break and then back on. Great. So I think maybe if we just sort of round up briefly back on the hospice. I mean, Nathan, any more comments, any reiteration of what was said?
Yes, so I think despite the rumor mills saying, oh gosh, I've had several people saying, oh gosh, maybe I'll miss my Burgundy 21. I'm not going to miss. I'm certainly not going to be missing it. I'm very excited to be tasting the En Primeur 2020s. As Tom said, we've done a number already, but we need to catch up with Nick and surpass him, of course, with our tastings next week. So the 2 key messages to take away for today are: if you'd like to join our Hospice syndicate, please let us know straight away. We really do need to capture all the pledges this week, because it is Sunday week, the bid, and we, unless you're in the syndicate and have paid up, you're not there. We don't do it later on. It's a one-off. And then in terms of Burgundy 2020, I've already seen a few people sort of sending a few emails out with some Bourgogne Blanc or something. We will be having our main tasting at 67 Pall Mall on the 11th of January, Jane's dinner on the 13th. Tom, who knows, we might do another Zoom briefing on 2020 as well, to give people more insight from a variety of producers, and once we've done more tastings. But if you'd like to be on our mailing lists for the Burgundy 2020, I think it's going to be a very exciting vintage, both for whites and for a variety of reds. So please make sure you're on our mailing list to pick those up. Our usual routine is that we'll have our full list around Christmas time, but we'll be able to give you insights into particular producers and particular wines before then. So there's nothing more exciting for me than going to Burgundy. I have to say, I'm like a pig in the proverbial when I can start snuffling around my favourite producers in November. To cap that off with the Hospice and then tasting loads of the stuff, I'm really, really looking forward to. And personally, as a collector, I wouldn't miss this vintage. I wouldn't miss either of these vintages. So there's never a vintage to miss. I always find that the ones that people dismiss are the ones that are most exciting a few years later on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Steve is
asking. Nathan, whilst you're answering Steve's question, it's probably easy just to pop those in the chat.
Yeah,
maybe
Steve, maybe put that up and post it.
Yeah. Maybe Jane, we could have a few kind of closing comments from you on anything you like, either the 2020, the 21, just Burgundy generally. Just whilst we've got you, it's nice to have your thoughts, really.
Well, right. Well, I think I've kind of said what I thought of the years. I mean, it's always interesting there. I know in 2017 when I put the wines into barrel, I went, oh, great. It's made a whole heap of really expensive rosé. And then in 2018, it's like, oh God, I feel like I've just made a whole heap of Barossa Shiraz, just because you get to the end of vintage, and it does one thing or another, and you know, we're probably all slightly, you know, a bit depressed. We're just tired. I think we're just tired by the end of harvest, but you know, they're very extreme things to say, but it really is also amazing the magic that happens. The aging of the wines in barrel and what happens to a vintage after 12 months as well. So the 21s, I think we're all, you know, it was a real challenge. And if you didn't have a sorting table, you had rocks in your head, because you know, that really was the thing that got people through. And I think at the end, and even when the frost hit here, everyone was like, oh my God, it's a catastrophe, there's no wine, you know, that's the end of the vintage, you know, we may as well all just go away on holidays. So the Burgundians are the first ones to throw their hands up, that, you know, the whole thing's a disaster. And then as season goes on and you actually see the vines start to grow out, then it's like, oh, actually, it's not as bad as what we thought it was. And, you know, so I think that's probably a good all-rounding comment for things that get out there. And when people aren't here to taste, or the wines aren't ready to taste, customers could only be guided by what they hear. And that's through generally, you know, well, social media as a platform these days, and there might just be little things of like, oh, disaster, catastrophe, like, you know, and people latch onto those things. So it continually surprises. Every year is different. We will always get trumped as winemakers by the terroir and the vintage. And so while after the fermentations, you feel like you did this or you did that, but then 12 months later, the vintage shines through, the parcel, the land, you know, the characters of the terroir shine through, and that's how it should be.
Yeah.
No, so totally. I'm actually excited about what the year's going to do.
No, that's fantastic, Jane. I think those are very encouraging words. And for anyone who's a Burgundy collector or yet to become so, you know, despite the challenges of the winemaker, you know, the wines are always rewarding, and you know, the different vintages show different facets of a vineyard and the winemaker behind it. And, you know, for me, it's just about when you drink those wines and who and what you drink them with. Frankly, it's never a question of, I'm not going to buy that wine that I love this year from this person who makes great wine. So that's just me, but hopefully it's all of you too.
I think too, just to add that, you know, a great wine or a good wine or a wine to be enjoyed, they don't always, the mark of a great wine doesn't be, will it age 50 years in my cellar either. So there are some vintages that will be better early. There are some vintages that need to wait. And that's also part of the, you know, it's part of the fun.
Brilliant. Jane, thank you so much. Unless anyone else has any comments or questions, if you do, by the way, then please, obviously there's been a few bits and pieces going on the chat. If anyone's actually got a live comment or question, then please go ahead and ask. Obviously, for those of you who need to drop off, head off for dinner, etc., thank you so much for joining us. I hope this has elicited some thrill of the upcoming vintages of Burgundy that we have. Obviously, massive thank you to Jane. Thank you, Nick and Nathan and Charlie as well for organising this. You may all leave now, but as I said, if you've got questions or comments for Jane or any of us, then please do ask away.